This podcast is brought to you by AutoVision and its new AI assistant, Avery. Avery delivers data-driven appraisals, pricing, and detailed strategies for every vehicle. Visit autovision.com to learn more about Avery, where precision meets profit.
Welcome to Daily Drive for Thursday, October 16th, 2025. I'm Kellen Walker in Las Vegas. Today on the show, U.S. and China export restrictions threaten BMW's chip supply. Vehicle cybersecurity concerns grow, and Waymo plans its Europe debut next year. Plus, our own Lawrence Iliff joins the show to break down August EV registration data and what it might tell us about what could happen to sales after the end of federal tax credits.
I've seen some of the analysts soften up. You start adding up the automakers that are going to kind of backfill, and you get to, a decent chunk of the market with popular models.
Let's run through all the news you need to know to keep up in the auto industry. BMW could face chip supply problems because of U.S. and Chinese export restrictions on Nexperia. The chip maker is at the center of growing concerns over intellectual property issues. A spokesperson for BMW says the automaker's production is continuing as planned. Mercedes-Benz said it was monitoring the situation and in touch with relevant stakeholders without giving further details. A spokesperson declined to say whether Nexperia was part of the company's supplier network. Volkswagen Group said the issue is not affecting its production and that it's also in contact with stakeholders in order to respond to any risk if necessary. Waymo plans to launch its driverless ride-hailing service in London next year. The move would mark its second international expansion and its first in Europe. A spokesperson says Waymo will begin testing a small fleet of its vehicles with safety drivers across a 100-square-mile area of London in the coming months. And developers think cybersecurity vulnerabilities are the biggest risk to the successful rollout of software-defined vehicles in the next 5 to 10 years. That's according to a new survey from QNX. Developers cited cybersecurity vulnerabilities most frequently when asked about the biggest risk to the SDV transition, 44% of the time. 58% of respondents also said that cybersecurity skills would be most critical for automotive software developers in the next 5 years. That's the most frequently named in the survey. The next common was functional safety. And those are today's headlines. You can find more details on all those stories at autonews.com. Joining me now to talk more about the new QNX survey that shows a lot of concerns over cybersecurity risk is our own Molly Boygon, who covers tech and innovation for us at Automotive News. She's also the co-host of the Shift podcast. Molly, welcome back to Daily Drive.
Thanks for having me, Cal.
So, Molly, how did developers express concerns about cybersecurity in the survey?
There were a bunch of different findings that indicated some developers looking closely at the issue of cybersecurity. So one was they were asked what they believe is the biggest risk to the software-defined vehicle transition, and the most commonly answered risk was cybersecurity. The other thing that came up was a question about what the most important skills for developers will be in the coming years. And they, again, most commonly answered cybersecurity. So there's some acknowledgement from people who work in the field, people who are developing the software for vehicles, that cybersecurity and developing products that can remain secure and withstand threats is going to be really important in the years coming forward.
And you write that the survey captures some tension between these cybersecurity concerns and regulations meant to address them. What's going on there?
Yes, the developer said that the regulation category that was most challenging to kind of keep up with was cybersecurity. There have been several regulations released out of Europe and then standards released from international standards organizations that require, for example, that companies maintain cybersecurity for products over the lifetime of the product. So even after it's been delivered and years have gone by, and even if the model is discontinued or something like that, they're still responsible for maintaining the cybersecurity of that product. So those types of regulations have posed some challenges for developers, even as they acknowledge that is a really important area of concern for the industry.
Interesting. Molly, good stuff. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Cal.
Coming up, we'll dive into the latest EV registration data and what it means for the future with our own Lawrence Iliff. That's next on Daily Drive.
Automotive News Shift podcast brings you the latest on automotive technology, trends, and transformation. I'm Hannah Lutz.
And I'm Molly Boygon. We're the new co-hosts of Shift, and we're excited to bring you new conversations with experts and industry insiders like this one with Larry Dominique, president of LD Management Consulting.
I do believe the legacy OEMs are falling into a trap. They've got to find a way to, in some ways, build a new airplane while they're still in flight.
Catch Shift, available every Sunday, wherever you get your podcasts.
Just when you think you've priced a vehicle perfectly to sell fast, the market changes and potential profit slips through your fingers. After all the work of scouring auction sites, tracking competitor rates, and analyzing market trends, the loss of time and money leaves you frustrated. Meet Avery, your AI assistant from AutoVision. Avery revolutionizes how you acquire, price, and sell vehicles by analyzing every detail, from retail values to market trends. And the best part? Avery doesn't just give you numbers, it explains every recommendation, so you know everything that was factored in. Picture this: faster appraisals, smarter stocking decisions, and more profitable sales, all without the exhausting legwork. With Avery, you don't just stay competitive, you lead the pack. Ready to see Avery in action? Visit autovision.com.
Welcome back to Daily Drive. I'm Kellen Walker. EV registrations jumped 24% from a year earlier in August to about 138,000 and captured more than 10% of the new car market in the U.S. It's the latest evidence of a massive EV pull forward before federal tax credits expired at the end of September. Our own Jake Neer reached automotive news reporter Lawrence Iliff at his home office in Silicon Valley.
Lonnie Iliff, as always, welcome back to Daily Drive.
It's great to be here.
We talk about EV registrations often, just about every month. This round of data feels different and probably is different because we're now talking about data that came out for about a month before the federal tax credits expired. And now we're talking after the federal tax credits have expired.
Yes.
So before we even touch on the numbers themselves, I want to hear kind of what is the value of this data this time around and how that compares to when we've talked about it in the past.
Okay, so what's great about this data, even though it's a little bit late, right, is that it gives you real registrations of cars, right? And so Tesla doesn't report US sales and they don't report sales by model. So we can look into Tesla, which has 40% of the market. We could say, these are the models that are doing good and bad, right? And we could do that with all the other automakers. Some of the automakers are good about reporting EV data and some aren't, but this is all the data and we can compare apples to apples, right? Because they're all registrations. And so we can go in there. And what's really interesting is, remember, President Trump signed the big, beautiful bill on July 4th, right? That got rid of the credits on September 30th. And so August is actually a really good month, right? It gave people time in July. What am I going to do? And stuff like that. And so this, to me, is kind of a really good, snapshot insight into what's going on. And there's some surprises.
So talk about that. What were the surprises for you?
I kind of thought that, a rising tide lifts all boats. And so, it's time to get my BMW i4, right? Before the tax credit goes away. Well, it looks no. To get my Cadillac Lyric, those were two models that were down. And so I think that it also depends on the incentives that the automakers were putting on these cars, right? Do I want to clear them out? And so you saw lots of volume models that were already doing well that just shot up, the Honda Prologue, the Chevrolet Equinox, the Hyundai Ioniq 5. And so people were kind of, rushing in there for value. And, I don't want to exaggerate too much, but it was kind of like Black Friday, right? Where, okay, this is my last opportunity, before Christmas or what, this is kind of my last opportunity for a while to go get those deals. Do I want the $299 big screen TV or the $499 big screen TV? One's better than others, sure, but the 299 is looking pretty good. I wasn't necessarily going to get a TV. Now I want one. And so I think, lots of bargain hunting, and the luxury brands just didn't do very well. I am surprised because, luxury buyers like a deal too. They're used to lease deals, in the luxury market. There's always, some good lease deals. And it was really a bargain hunting thing. And there's no other data set that I've seen that gives that kind of granularity.
So we talked about these numbers on yesterday's show, and we played a clip from a conversation you had with Auto Pacific's Ed Kim, an analyst who looks at this data as well. He said he wasn't so surprised about the winners and losers being, the mainstream sort of mass market brands as the winners and luxury as the losers. What was his take on this, and was he, in good company?
Yeah, he was also looking at some, particular data that gives you some ideas, right? And that Lease Hacker, which is, a website in which people talk about the actual leases that they've got or tips or whatever. And what he was seeing was that, the crazy lease deals were really on EVs in general. But in particular, the volume EVs, the Equinoxes and the Prologues and the Ioniq 5s. And from that, you could get these cars for less than, a Toyota Corolla, a lease, right? Hyundai Elantra. And so he just saw these fantastic deals, and he said that's where people are going to rush, right? In terms of, some of the luxury cars and some of these other vehicles, those deals have been around for a while, right? You get 7,500 in a lease, usually passed on from the automaker. But he was seeing like these very, cases where people kind of rush in there and, get that, grab that Xbox or whatever they want. And so he had some early insight into that.
Yeah, I mean, the people who are most likely to really want to get an affordable monthly payment are probably the people that are more likely to go toward the Equinoxes and the Prologues and things like that, right? As opposed to, like you said, the BMWs.
Right, because those we know what those deals are, and obviously it depends on the automakers. I did a separate story with a list, right, and so like the Tesla Model Y, which did extremely well, had about $5,100 in incentives, and that was about flat. But that's a very popular car, and so if you want a Model Y, that was the time to get it. August and September, obviously. The incentives on the Prologue in August were 12,704, according to Motor Intelligence.
My goodness,
up from 5,800 a year earlier. So obviously, on a lease, that's a couple $100 a month, right?
Well, I mean, you could get a Prologue EV and a used car on top of it, basically.
Yes, for the $7,000 or whatever's in there. And then, the ID4 was also 15,000, up from, about 11 a year earlier. And, and then you saw like cars that didn't do very well, like the Lyric was down. It was only down 6%, but it was down. And those incentives, went down from 10,000 to 8,600. So not a big difference, but you can see how, not on every model, but how these, incentives and the volume go up and down. Looking at the future, I think that's going to depend on how EV sales do. And that is, how much are automakers willing to backfill that $7,500? How much do they want to sell EVs? What is their tolerance for losing money on EVs until they make money on EVs?
That's such a great point. And you also mentioned the Tesla Model Y. It's interesting in the context of how you frame the article with, again, luxury sort of being the brands that fell, and then the mainstream brands being the ones that did so well in August. If you were going to draw a diagram with those two circles, I think Tesla would probably be one of the brands right in the middle, right? So
yeah, I agree.
How did Tesla as a brand do, especially because we also just reported recently about how Tesla saw this kind of global bounce back recently. So how did Tesla do in this data?
Yeah, so Tesla's been down all year, and this is an up month for them, right? Mm-hmm. So they were up 8% overall, but it was all the Model Y. The Model Y was up by 45%. Every other car fell, even the Model 3, right?
Wow, interesting.
So, and the Model 3 had a lot of incentives on it. And so when I asked Tom Libby of S&P Global Mobility, what he said basically is the 3 and the Y are on the same platform. They're kind of similar cars if you're going back and forth. And in this case, that the Black Friday buyers went the other way. They went for the $499. They went for the more expensive one because the Model Y is just such a different car in terms of the owner. It's a utility vehicle. People want crossovers. And also Tesla has been willing to throw around incentives, and not just in the US, in other markets too. You've seen their margins come way down as they put more money on the hood and more money on the hood. And so Tesla's playing that same game now, and they're all in there, trying to find these buyers for EVs, and it's really down to price.
Yeah, it's really interesting. One surprise to me looking through the list was Toyota, and people might be yelling at their car radios or whatever they're listening to this on right now at me as someone who might not be following the ins and outs of every single kind of move here. But Toyota, to me, it seemed like was the only mainstream brand that seems to be not really making huge changes to its EV product plans. Nissan also fell in August, but Nissan's had some very public, issues with their EV programs. Now, Toyota has the BZ4X, which, we've been seeing commercials for it. It's a newer model, but EV sales sank for Toyota 31% in August. So what's going on there?
It's really interesting because when you talk to the analysts, they all say, "Oh, Toyota's doing great. Toyota's doing great. Toyota." And the reason Toyota's doing great is because Toyota's all in on hybrids. I mean, just the Camry's only a hybrid. The RAV4 is only a hybrid. They have like lots and lots of hybrids, and they just seized on the moment. They were right. And a lot of people gave them a lot of heat about it, but US consumers just aren't ready to make that big transition. They're making it, it's happening, charging's getting better, the process, but hybrids, you go to the gas station, you don't change your behavior. And so, Toyota has one EV. It sells when they have like great deals on it. It doesn't sell when they don't have great deals on it. It's not considered like a really good EV. They're getting better. There's a new generation coming out. And so it's just Toyota's focus is on hybrids. They're killing it. Hybrids are doing great. Hybrids are doing better than EVs, in terms of the percentage of the market, generally 8% for EVs this year and double that more or less for hybrids, according to S&P Global. And so, they're not focused on it yet. They will be, but they're not focused on it yet.
Got it. Okay. So before I let you go, Lonnie, I want to ask you about looking forward. When we're talking about this in a couple months and we have this October data and afterward, what are analysts saying is their expectations now, or are their expectations now? Are they still expecting a massive drop after the loss of the federal EV tax credits starts showing up in the data? Is there any reason to think at this point that might change their expectations?
I think, analysts, they expected kind of like a cold turkey effect, right? Where, the incentives are gone. The $7,500 is gone. The automakers, most aren't making money on EVs already. Do they want to backfill? Do they want to, kind of maybe look to the next generation of EVs or promote the ones they have, or what they would do? And we saw some signs, GM and Ford and Hyundai in terms of, talking about continuing automaker incentives, or in Hyundai's case, cutting the price. And so I've seen some of the analysts soften up, right, and say, well, it looks like obviously, Tesla came out with lower priced Model Y and Model 3. And so, Tesla's 40% of the market, GM is, 10 or so, and then Hyundai. And so you start adding up the automakers that are going to kind of backfill, and you get to, a decent chunk of the market with popular models, right? The models that we're talking about. And so people are saying, maybe it won't be like falling off a cliff, go from, 10% of the market to, 4% of the market. Maybe it'll be, 10 and 6 or 10 and 7. They didn't give me those numbers. I'm just giving some examples, right?
Mm-hmm.
But maybe a softer landing. But I think that really opens up the question of, you have a softer landing because you don't want the fourth quarter, to go to hell, right? Yeah. But then you come back in January, in February, do I want to keep subsidizing these EVs? Which ones do I want to subsidize? Which ones do I want to phase out? Do I want to start promoting hybrids that have little margin on them? And, we just don't know because, the automakers haven't told us what they're going to do yet. They've told us what they're going to do kind of in the short term on some of them, But I think next year's a wild card. I really do.
As always, Lonnie, really appreciate your insights on this and your reporting. And it's going to be, don't expect me to be reaching out to you next month, the month after that, and so on and so forth, because we have a lot to talk about in the coming several months. Thanks again. Really appreciate you joining us on Daily Drive.
Great to be here.
That's Daily Drive for today. I'm Kellen Walker. Thanks to automotive news journalist Molly Boygon for her reporting for today's podcast. You can get the latest news on EV sales, supply chain issues, and everything happening in the auto industry at autonews.com. Come back tomorrow for a look at how the auto finance sector is adopting digital tools.
It's becoming more and more apparent that the automotive industry has made very significant strides in digitization, both on the e-contracting side as well as on the securitization side.
We'd love to hear from you. Let us know what you think of the show and the topics we covered today. Send us an email at dailydrive@autonews.com or leave us a voicemail at 313-444-2774. And if you enjoy the podcast, remember to like, leave a review, and subscribe so you never miss an episode.